The stream is about to begin.
All right, my Right at Ivy Right fans, I got a good one for us today. Angela Duckworth's commencement address to Bates College. All things cell phone. This is perfect for where I'm at. So I'm in New York State. Governor Hochul has placed a cell phone ban on our students. So I'm going to begin my year right here talking about the cell phones and that anxiety that's created with the separation. So we're going to do a rhetorical analysis of this speech, and I'm going to do what I typically do. I'm going to walk you through the whole process, start to finish, and just paint a whole bunch of exemplars for you. So I'll start with the introductory paragraph, and we'll use my heuristic called the declarative thesis, and then we'll move into the body paragraphs, and I'll break down another heuristic that we use to house those paragraphs called the syllogistic method, and then I'll show you how to tag a conclusion on it. So from start to finish, I will paint the whole essay with you. So sit tight, strap up, stay tuned, and I'll walk you through it. All right, my Right at Ivy Right friends. So I started with a very generic prompt, given that this is going to be one of our first rhetorical analyses of the year. So you can see here, it's super nuts and bolts, very simple. I don't want to throw any curveballs or monkey wrenches at my students this early in the academic year. So my prompt reads as simply as this. The following is a passage from psychologist and author Angela Duckworth as she delivers the commencement address to the graduating class at Bates College. Read the passage carefully, write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Duckworth makes to develop her address to the attendees of the ceremony. Told you, very, very, very basic. So I just want my students to be able to do an introductory level rhetorical analysis. Mind you, at this stage of the year, they've had very limited exposure to the terms, the devices, the techniques. We've done a few orientative exercises with them, but they're far from fluent yet. So I just want to use this prompt, this particular essay, to lay the foundation of how do you use my heuristics of the declarative thesis and the syllogistic method, and how do you, in general, in a roundabout way, structure a rhetorical analysis. So let's dive right in. First question you got to ask is, how do I write the intro? For those that are familiar with my work, you know that I have a cheat or a hack that I tend to give my students for both AP Lang and AP Lit for the literary analysis and the rhetorical analysis prompts. I think that implicit in all the prompts, you're being asked two questions. The first one is, how does the author construct meaning? And the second one is, what is the author's intent, or what is the authorial intent? So you'll see that I have a 3 next to the first question and a 1 next to the second question. Here's how we're going to riff on this. 3 sentences will go to the construction of meaning, and 1 sentence goes to authorial intent. Now, here's the kicker with this. Whenever you begin an introductory paragraph with the construction of meaning sentence, ta-da, it gets us to a declarative thesis. When you answer the construction of meaning question, by default, you're laying down the thesis. So when you declare a thesis, you begin with it. And that's what we're going to do for rhetorical analysis. So first 3 sentences are going to be about the construction of meaning, and then you're going to have 1 sentence for authorial intent. There's other little bit parts that go in here. Since we do have an academic audience, I want to see a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary. And I simply mean by that your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. If you deep dive into my YouTube channel, you'll see that I run something called a Nuance Academy very early in the academic year. It probably takes me about the first quarter, the first 10 weeks of school, to teach my kids the following. So we read a book called Strunk White, Write It Right. And in my YouTube channel, there are some links to this. It's a free out of print manual. So My school doesn't have a ton of money, so whenever we can get free supplies, we take it. And in it, they have something called rule number 18, which espouses the idea that there's 12 sentence types. So let's say, for example, you were to write me an independent clause. I could rewrite that 11 different ways, just manipulating the syntax and basically expressing the exact same thing. So those are the ingredients in here. By context and background, you're getting to the authorial intent. And as I've stated, the first three sentences are going to go the route of construction of meaning. That might be a little nebulous and pie in the sky for kids. So one of the best practices that I endorse is this. You got to Bob Ross your instruction. So write with and for your students. Get to that proverbial easel and canvas and demonstrate how to do this. And that's what I'm going to do in this particular writing workshop is I wrote a few and I'll share them with you. So let's paint and see what we got cooking here. So here's exemplar number 1. I'll read it and then I'll break it down with you. In a world increasingly dominated by digital distraction, the speaker addresses the modern dependence on cell phones with humor and insight. The speech emerges from the exigence of society's growing inability to separate from technology, even in the most mundane moments of life. Through a jocular tone and clever anecdotal storytelling, the speaker engages the audience while highlighting absurdities of modern smartphone usage. Ultimately, the speech delivers a thoughtful message. While cell phones offer connection and convenience, they also risk diminishing the quality of our real-world experiences and relationships. So I really like this one for a number of reasons. One is, early in the academic year, I want to show my students how to oscillate or teeter-totter back and forth between implicitly stating the term and then explicitly. So you can see in that first sentence where we talk about humor and insight, we're implying the pathos. But you'll also see some explicit use of terms, devices, and techniques. And I really like this teeter-totter balance approach so that everything's not so front-loaded, because you're going to see in the first premise when we get to the body paragraphs that if you implied up front in the thesis, you're going to explicitly state it and vice versa, or imply both times if it's relatively clear. In terms of sentence constructs, here's what I point out to my students. Sentence 1 should not read like sentence 2. They should be different. Sentence 3 should be different than 2 and 4 different from 3. That's one good little safeguard that students can manipulate to ensure that they have good voice rhythm and flow. And you can see I'm doing some trick-orated things in here with my syntax, especially in that fourth sentence with the use of the colon. And that's what my students are going to take away from the Nuance Academy. Things like colons and em dashes that you see in here. Elongated sentences, short sentences. You have to be able to wield sentences like that in order to have really good flow. So let's paint another one and take a look at sample number 2. Using humor as a powerful appeal to pathos. So that's very explicit. I'm not a big fan of that, but again, early in the year, I'm okay with my students doing that. The speaker delivers a lighthearted yet sharp critique of society's obsession with cell phones, particularly among members of Gen Z. Through a series of vivid and relatable anecdotes, the speech illustrates just how deeply ingrained smartphone use has become in everyday life. While the tone remains playful, the underlying message is clear. Constant phone use is eroding genuine human interaction and self-awareness. By blending comedy and cultural commentary, the speaker challenges the audience to reflect on their own habits and reconsider the role of technology in their lives. So to break this down, just like the first one, you get 3 sentences that either explicitly or implicitly use the terms, devices, techniques. 1 sentence hammers the author's intent. Students and teachers often ask me, does it have to be arranged like this, Mr. Kuhn? First 3 sentences, construction of meaning. Last sentence, authorial intent. No, you don't need to be that anal retentive to it. You can blend it and shift things around a little bit, but in the end, it is going to equal 3 plus 1. But you can shape shift it however you want. You can see in both of these that I have a fair amount of tier 2 level vocabulary in here. Really nice word choice. You don't want to overdo it. And again, early in the academic year, I want to disabuse students of the following notion. A lot of kids come to class and they're like, if I use $1 million word, somehow I'm going to do really impressive work and impress Mr. Kuhn. And the idea is no. If you use, if you sound like a walking, talking thesaurus, that's not good writing. You want the words to fit your mouth and to be within your lexile level. And I'm trying to model that for my students in this one. So as always in my presentations, I always show the introduction 3 times. So let's roll the brush one more time and take a look at number 3. With a tone that keeps the audience laughing, the speaker highlights the absurdity of life ruled by the glow of a smartphone screen. Stories of awkward encounters and everyday moments serve as both entertainment and quiet warning. Beneath the humor lies a sharper observation about a generation so tethered to their devices that they risk missing the world around them. The speech playfully exposes a shared truth. Our phones may connect us, but they often keep us from being truly present. So again, this is truly 3 plus 1. Some implicit, explicit, cooking the sentence construct so that there's no redundancy at sentence level. And I'll end the introductory portion of this workshop by talking about this. I always tell my students that redundancy is the bane of the writer's existence. And especially with young, emerging, struggling writers, they tend to overuse adjective clauses and independent clauses. That's something very elementary that I see in student writing. So you even don't want to repeat at sentence level in terms of the constructs. Now, as we move into the body paragraphs, we need to be mindful of this. The words that we use up top in the introduction, we need to use synonyms or approximations of them in the body paragraphs, again, to avoid that layer of redundancy. So the question becomes, and how about the bodies? How do I write the body paragraphs? I alluded to this earlier. My students are going to use a heuristic called the syllogistic method. It comes from Aristotle. He had a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd often throw out these juicy, essential questions. And you see one such example in Plato's Republic, where they tussle with, what is justice? So these philosophical, think tankers step to the proverbial mic and poof, they drop their definition of justice. And Aristotle, like us composition teachers, noted something. Some students are able to sustain a line of reasoning far more cogently than others. So he said, I got to figure this out. And what he did was figuratively open up the lid of the brain of the better orators. And he had a eureka moment. And he said, aha, I got it. These kids are arguing syllogistically. They have tight lines of reasoning. And all that means is this. You're packaging your logic in kind of a mathematical or calculative manner, in the sense that you go from premise 1, premise 2 to conclusion. So let me give you an example. If I were to say to you, premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you'd all nod your head and say, yep, Kristian, you are correct. But let me give you some textual support in premise 2. If I say, this morning I walked into my kitchen to make a cup of coffee, and I noticed that Pickles, my dog, was beneath the kitchen sink. The cupboards were all open. And I said, oh no, Pickles. And he pulled his head out, and all over his muff and his grizzle, he had white powder stuck to his whiskers. And then I were to tell you in the second premise that the previous night, I put arsenic in there because we have a rat infestation problem. Naturally, logically, cogently, you would say, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for Pickles. Your dog is going to die. And we have a thought bubble there, right? We have a cohesive argument that goes full circle on itself, and it's a clearly delineated line of reasoning. So oftentimes in writing, where kids go wrong is not necessarily in the compositional aspects of the piece in terms of the grammar, the punctuation, the syntax. It's the flow and progression of those ideas. They break the math, they break the numbers. They don't have all the pieces of the necessary components and the argument. So how do we morph Aristotle's heuristic and turn it into something for rhetorical analysis? Here's what I got, right? And students that are following along, you probably want to write this down. Premise number one is an argument containing terms, techniques, and devices. Again, if you implied up top, you can imply again, just use synonyms. And then if you were explicit up top, you want to imply here. So no redundancies. There's math involved in a syllogism, and the first premise is going to be 3 sentences long exactly. And I'm going to model this a couple of times for you. You don't want any quotes or paraphrases in there because we want to keep our argument central, okay? And again, I'll model that. So I know it's a little wavy gravy as I describe it, but you'll see it in just a second. The second premise begins at the 4th sentence. And here's where I want students to start quoting and paraphrasing. Ideally, all right, students should have multiple layers of embedded quotes in here. And for an introductory essay, I'm going to tell my kids quote at least 3 times, okay, because they're going to be multitasking up in that first premise and discussing a few terms, devices, and techniques. So we'll need quotes in order to keep the promise of the first premise. Paragraphs need to be concluded. So the conclusion of the body paragraph is where the textual analysis is going to come in. Last piece of math. This is all going to take about 10 to 12 sentences. So let's ask ourselves this question. What's a first premise look like? All right, here it is. So students ask me all the time, where should I begin? And I say, start where Duckworth begins. So what are her rhetorical moves up top in her speech? So I like the following stem, and my students use this all the time. Right from the onset, comma. So students that are playing along, steal that, right? It cues the reader into knowing that you have a logical progression, that you're going to be very deliberate in your analysis and in your argument. So my students steal that from me right from the onset. From here, we want to imply some terms. We can explicitly state the terms, but we're going to riff for 3 sentences. This gives us a lot of space to multitask and hit a whole bunch of terms, devices, and techniques all at once. And that precludes us from doing 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax, which is way too plotting for a college essay. So look at my 3 sentences here. Right from the onset, Duckworth opens with impromptu humor, feigning distraction by asking President Jenkins to hold her phone and then mischievously requesting his in return, right? That's the very first thing that happens. So that's nicely expressed. And again, you can imply or be explicit. This playful exchange immediately relaxes the audience, lowering the formality of the occasion and making her presence feel approachable. By making herself the butt of the joke, pretending she cannot be trusted with her own cell phone obsession, Duckworth transforms a universal anxiety into a moment of collective laughter, priming listeners for the larger argument about focus and self-control that follows. So you can see, I'm a big fan of implication. I think that when students just hammer the reader's head with explication, it's too dutiful, it's too plotting, and it's not as artful as the art of implication. So let's take a look at another one, all right? Another first premise, just to make sure we got this. So again, you're going to start with right from the onset. And again, 3 sentences, no quotes, no paraphrases, just set up your argument so that it's central. Right from the onset, Duckworth's tone is jocular and seemingly extemporaneous, as she playfully asks the college president to hold her phone and then cheekily requests his in return. And again, that's the very first rhetorical situation. What feels like a spontaneous digression disarms the solemnity of the occasion, drawing the audience into a moment of levity that feels unscripted and human. Beneath the humor, however, lies the exigence of the speech, the urgent need to confront a culture of constant cell phone use that threatens attention, connection, and presence. So you can see there in the end, you guys that get into my Nuance Academy, that last sentence has a trio. Attention 1, connection 2, presence 3. So students in that Nuance Academy will learn how to layer and texture their sentences with duos and trios, which is pretty cool. And I'm doing all the syntactical jazz and ninja-ry that I was doing in the introductory paragraph in the body paragraphs, right? Same concepts for the voice, the rhythm, the flow. So let's skip to the fourth sentence and ask ourselves this. How do you transition to the second premise? Well, here's what I do. I have my students write that first premise, and then I say this to them. What is the promise of the first premise? It's because what you promise in there predicates or predetermines the quotes that you will select. So I have them go quote hunting. And I do an exercise early in the year where I have my students print out their first premises in like 48-point font, and we tape them around the room. And then students go around and we help each other with that quote selection, because that's a hard trick to teach and a hard concept to learn. How to align the quotes with the promise of the first premise. So teachers, you may want to do that. So here is my second premise for an example here. I have one simple stem, and it's immediately comma. My students begin their fourth sentences all the time with that, because it ties back to the very first promise of the first premise when you say immediately. So you need a quote and or paraphrase that ties to the first promise of the first premise. So let's see what we got here. Immediately, Duckworth underscores this playful spontaneity when she remarks, I don't want to get distracted up here, so I wonder if you might hold on to my phone, turning what could have been a simple request to a humorous performance of her own vulnerability. All right, so that ties back to the top part of the first premise. That's a perfect quote. Inside my YouTube channel, I have videos on some frames that I've created to embed quotes, and I'll quickly hit upon it here. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational and perfectly embedded, as this one does, right? You can't necessarily hear the quote in it. Right. I tell my students, I want this to be very conversational, and I don't want to hear an abrupt quote transition. It should kind of flow into the fabric of the sentence naturally. So when you quote, you got to analyze. She extends the moment with another jest. Would you mind if I held your phone too? I promise to give it back. I swear. A line that not only elicits laughter, but also spotlights the shared obsession with devices. This humor, while light, is purposeful. It frames the cell phone as both comic prop and symbolic intruder in daily life. As she transitions, Duckworth notes, parting with your phone may be causing some anxiety, a statement that shifts the tone from laughter to recognition, underscoring the deeper exigence of her message, that the small habitual act of keeping a phone close can quietly erode presence, focus, and human connection. So I'm not done yet, because we're trying to get to like 10 to 12 sentences. And there's still more that we promise that we have to quote and or paraphrase. So let's go to the next slide. She makes this critique explicit by reminding her audience that your generation, Gen Z, is spending more than 6 hours a day on their phones. Extending the point, she sharpens the concern with a comparison. Teenagers in the United States are now up to about 8 hours a day on screens. That's 56 hours a week, a full half of their waking lives. and using humor to usher her listeners towards this sobering reality. And then you get into the conclusion here. You got to wrap it up. Duckworth transforms laughter into reflection. Ultimately, her light-hearted opening underscores the urgency of her call to resist the pull of constant distraction and reclaim the presence and focus essential for a meaningful life. And that took me all of 12 sentences to do. All right, you can see that the promise of the first premise is kept. All the quotes and paraphrases are germane and linked to that. And this is a perfect line of reasoning, right? I love teaching that concept early in the academic year because it's one of the hardest things for students to grasp is logic, right? How do you be cogent in your writing? So I think most of my kids have all the ideas in their head because we will have tackled this text together and unpacked it. So the ideas are there. It's just a matter of capturing it really cohesively on paper. And that's one of the reasons why I love to Bob Ross it. So just because this is an introductory essay, I only want it to be 4 paragraphs long. I just want my students to experiment with this a little bit. So the question becomes, what do I do next? And it's simple. You just bust out another syllogism. So I'll give you an example of the first premise. So again, you're kind of at the bottom third of the essay, the middle of the essay, the speech. Let me clarify that of Duckworth's speech. You've analyzed the top third. So you take a look at the text and say, what lit terms, devices, techniques are there in this portion of the text? And then you riff 3 sentences around that, right? Because the first premise is always 3 sentences. So I have my students steal this stem as she advances her address, comma, right, to show a continuation. I know it's not the most artful thing to do, but for the beginning of the academic year, I'm fine with this. So look where I go. As she advances her address, Duckworth shifts from playful humor to research-based authority, weaving psychological studies on situation modification into her argument to demonstrate that resisting distraction is less about willpower and more about shaping one's environment. So you get this huge tonality shift and shift in logos around that part. So I'm highlighting that. It's important. So let's see here. She amplifies the urgency through metaphor, likening phones to pacifiers for adults and invoking an old proverb that warns people become devoted to whatever they keep closest to them. By the end, she returns to a communal appeal, encouraging graduates to live with greater intentionality, reminding them that reclaiming their attention is inseparable from building meaningful relationships and powerful and purposeful lives. So again, I pause right here and I'm like, all right, guys, blow up your first premises, tape them around the room, students go around and plug in the quotes. And I just have whiteboard markers and crayons and stuff, and students actually write down the necessary quotes as they go textual support hunting. And then you just finish out that body paragraph. You're shooting for 10 to 12 sentences. So let's talk about wrapping the essay up and tagging a conclusion on it. Early in the academic year, I use stems, and I kind of make a comparison to this. A conclusion of an essay is like the 4th of July fireworks display, and you have the grand finale. The conclusion paragraph is the grand finale. So you're going to hammer exigence, hit the big overarching theme, and it should only take about 4 sentences or so to wrap this up. So my students say things like, simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done, at the end of the day. So I'm going to use at the end of the day. Just look where this goes. At the end of the day, Duckworth reminds her audience that the small, ordinary choice of where to keep a phone can shape the trajectory of a life. Through humor, personal anecdotes, and research, she illustrates how constant proximity to devices quietly drains attention and weakens human connection. Her central claim is that willpower alone cannot safeguard focus. Instead, people must deliberately modify their situations to make wise choices easier. Ultimately, she urges graduates to reclaim their attention as an act of intentional living, ensuring that presence and purpose outweigh distraction. And ta-da, we have ourselves a completed essay. So that's it from here. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or want to know a little more about my heuristics, you got a couple of choices. You can deep dive into my YouTube channel, or feel free to drop me an email. I love it when teachers reach out, and even students. My email address is writeatibright@gmail.com. I love being study buddies with students and teachers. I love helping out. I love being of service. So you're never a bother to me to reach out with questions. Teachers, I likewise am going to create all new material for my rhetorical analysis units this year, because at my school we have a very active black market where, juniors take AP Lang and the seniors sell last year's essays to them. So we've done everything we can to eliminate ChatGPT, but we have not eliminated the black market. So I am creating new material, and you'll see in my YouTube channel that my first rhetorical analysis is going to be Kermit the Frog's commencement address at the University of Maryland. My second one is going to be this Angela Duckworth. And if you want me to do any rhetorical analysis writing workshops, you got a good commencement address or a speech or a piece of any kind, let me know, and maybe we can cobble something together. So that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this one, and take care for now.